The sirens cut through the night, chasing silence off the empty street. Two officers stepped out, boots scraping pavement. One adjusted his belt, the other rested a hand near his holster. "License and registration," the taller one snapped, his voice already edged with suspicion. Inside the car, Elijah Carter breathed once, slowly. He rolled the window down. His suit sleeve caught the streetlight, neat, pressed, deliberate. "Evening, officer," Elijah said, calm but flat. "What's the reason for the stop?" The shorter one leaned in, squinting at him. "Car matches the description of a stolen vehicle. Step out." Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. He didn't argue. Narration filled the silence. He had lived long enough to know the script. Arguing only fed their certainty. Silence was heavier. "I can provide proof this is my car," he said quietly. "Step out," the taller officer repeated, sharper this time. A few doors opened nearby. A woman whispered to her child, pulling him close. A man across the street raised his phone, recording. Elijah unbuckled his seatbelt, every movement slow. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket. His calmness unsettled them, though they wouldn't admit it. "You carrying anything?" the short one asked. "Only what's mine," Elijah replied. A pause lingered. The taller officer smirked faintly, as if control had already been sealed. But the quiet around them grew, pressing down on every gesture. Narration cut in. Every flash of red and blue wasn't just light. It was history repeating, suspicion wearing a badge. He stood there, not as a senator, not yet, but as another. Black man accused before heard. The handcuffs gleamed in the taller officer's grip. The night braced for humiliation. The taller officer's voice cut into the night, flat and sharp. "This car's reported stolen, matches the description." Elijah kept his eyes steady, though the weight pressed heavy inside his chest. "It's registered in my name. Papers are in the glove box." The shorter officer stepped closer, flashlight aimed at his face. "That's what they all say." His tone wasn't curious, it was final. A hush spread across the small crowd forming at the corner. The man with the phone kept recording, his hand trembling slightly. Elijah's jaw tightened. "Check the registration. You'll see my name." The taller one chuckled under his breath. "Funny thing about thieves, they get good at paperwork." Narration whispered beneath the silence. He had heard this before. Not the exact words, but the same script. Proof dismissed, dignity stripped, accusation treated as evidence. Elijah drew a breath. "You're accusing me because of my face, not this car." The short officer's eyes flickered, caught for a second, before he masked it with another order. "Hands on the hood." Elijah didn't move. His voice stayed even. "I'm not resisting. I'm reminding you, you're wrong." That calmness unsettled them more than defiance. Power demanded fear, not composure. The taller officer shoved forward. "On the hood now," the recording man muttered, low but audible. "He said it's his car." A ripple of unease spread. Narration crept in again. Every accusation carried ghosts, men dragged out of cars, women silenced, children watching fathers cuffed for surviving with brown skin. Tonight, it was his turn to be the echo. Elijah placed his hands on the hood, slow, deliberate. His silence screamed louder than protest. The officers had control. Yet for the first time, they looked uncertain holding it. The night pressed down, the cold metal beneath Elijah's palms burning through. His skin. The officers expected resistance, expected his voice to crack, but nothing came, just silence, the kind that didn't bend. The shorter officer shifted uneasily. "You think staying quiet makes you innocent?" His words were sharp, but his eyes flickered toward the crowd, where lenses glowed like watchful eyes. Elijah raised his head just enough to meet him. "I don't have to prove innocence. That's your burden, not mine." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The taller officer clenched his jaw, hand tightening on the baton at his side. Silence had stripped him of control. Narration whispered. He remembered his father telling him once, "Sometimes silence speaks louder than 1,000 protests." Tonight, that silence was heavier than chains, thicker than air, impossible to ignore. "Thou." Officer spat near his feet. "You people always play the victim." Elijah's breathing slowed, steady. "If you believed that, you wouldn't need cuffs to make me smaller." The words landed sharp, cutting through the crowd. A woman near the curb gasped softly. The taller officer froze, caught between action and shame. Still, Elijah stayed bent over the hood, not struggling, not flinching. The crowd leaned closer, waiting for the breaking point, but none came. His silence filled every space their authority tried to claim. The shorter one barked, "Say something!" Elijah's reply was barely a whisper, but it carried. "I already did." The crowd understood. The silence itself was his statement, his refusal to play their script. And in that moment, the officer's power felt thinner, as if their uniforms weighed heavier than his restraint. ChatGPT said. A man in a work jacket muttered, "Keep your head up, brother," his phone steady in his hand. Another voice, a young woman's, cut through the cold air. "We see you. Don't let them break you." The officer's posture stiffened as the crowd swelled, as if the presence of witnesses threatened to undo their authority more than Elijah's silence ever could. The taller officer hissed, "Put those phones away. This isn't a show." But no one moved. Fingers stayed fixed on glowing screens. The silence of the crowd spoke louder than shouts. Each lens was a shield, each click of recording a warning. "We are watching." Elijah finally turned his head, meeting the circle of eyes. "They've always wanted shadows," he murmured, voice steady. "But tonight, you're giving me light." Narration pressed through his mind. He had been on stages before, under brighter lights, in halls where his voice filled the room. Yet never had his silence reached this far, never had it carried this weight. The truth was no longer just his. It belonged to the street, to every trembling hand holding a phone, to every voice too tired to shout. The shorter officer barked, "Step back! This is police business." From the crowd, a teenager replied, "Not anymore. This is everybody's business." His words carried the sharpness of generations behind them. The officers exchanged glances. Authority once absolute, now cracked beneath. The heat of eyes unblinking, cameras unflinching. Elijah didn't move, didn't resist. But the weight shifted. He no longer stood alone. Every recording lens tightened the walls around the officers. Every silent witness turned their silence into judgment. And for the first time, it was not Elijah who seemed restrained, but the men gripping his arms. The officer's grip was iron until Carter shifted his wrist, the chain of the handcuff dangling just inches away from closing. A quiet snap of leather broke the air as he pulled free a wallet. No words, no grand gesture. Just the slow reveal of a badge. The taller officer froze. "What is this?" His voice trembled, though he tried to steady it. Carter's tone was low, even. "You were about to cuff a United States senator." Gasps rippled through the crowd. A woman whispered, "Senator?" Phones leaned in closer, recording every blink, every silence. The shorter officer stepped back as if burned. This doesn't change what we saw." His words cracked in the middle, unsure but still clinging to authority like a lifeline. Carter looked at him, steady and unblinking. "It changes everything. Because now you'll have to explain to the country why your first instinct was chains, not questions." Narration pressed against the moment. The badge wasn't armor. It was exposure. The truth didn't need a shield. It needed a mirror. Tonight, that mirror was in their hands, in their cameras, in the silence that cut deeper, then shouts. The taller officer's jaw clenched. "You think that badge makes you untouchable?" Carter leaned closer, his words almost a whisper. "No, but it makes you visible." A boy in the crowd muttered, "They're done." The officers heard it too. Their eyes darted from Carter to the circle of strangers, every lens reflecting back the crumbling mask of power. The cuff slipped from the officer's fingers, clattering softly on the pavement. That sound carried more weight than sirens, and in the stillness that followed, it wasn't Carter who looked bound, but the men who had tried to bind him. The crowd didn't move, didn't speak, only the faint clicks of camera shutters and the red glow of phones lifted high. The officers' faces tightened, eyes darting between Carter, the badge, and the people who had witnessed it all. The taller officer swallowed hard. This isn't what it looks like." His voice cracked, too thin to cover the fear creeping in. From somewhere behind Carter, a man spoke low but clear. "It looks exactly like what it is." The words cut through, carried by silence more than volume. The shorter officer shifted his stance, trying to regain footing. "You don't understand," Carter interrupted, quiet, deliberate. "No, everyone here understands. That's the problem." Narration lingered over the moment. For years, the story had always belonged to them, the ones in uniform, the ones who wrote the reports. But tonight, the story was stolen back, framed in pixels, frozen in the unblinking eyes of strangers. Their authority wasn't erased. It was recorded. The taller officer lowered his hand, the cuff dangling, useless. He whispered, barely audible, "We're finished." Carter didn't gloat, didn't move closer. He simply let the silence sit heavy, a silence that spoke louder than protest. The weight wasn't his. It pressed on their shoulders now. A young woman near the front raised her phone higher. "This is going everywhere," she said. The officers heard it as a sentence. The shorter one turned away, staring at the ground as if looking for a way out. But there was none. Not from the lights, not from the truth, not from the badge still gleaming faintly in Carter's hand. The night didn't just capture humiliation. It captured an ending. That flash didn't blind. It burned. The sound of metal clicking shut was louder than the traffic passing by. Elijah was only 12, but the sight of his father's hands bound behind his back carved something permanent into him. People slowed as they walked past the grocery store, some pretending not to notice, others staring long enough to remember. The officer said nothing at first, only pressed harder on the cuffs. Elijah's father winced but kept his eyes forward. "Sir, what's the charge?" his mother asked, her voice trembling. "Suspicion," the officer muttered. "Suspicion of what?" she pressed, though softer this time. The man in uniform didn't answer. His silence weighed heavier than words could. Narration carried Elijah's memory. That was the night he learned silence wasn't always peace. Sometimes silence was a weapon. Sometimes silence cut deeper than shouting ever could. Elijah tugged at his mother's sleeve. "He didn't do anything." His words were small, almost swallowed by the city noise. His father glanced at him, just once, and shook his head as if to say, "Don't speak, son. Don't make it worse." That look stayed with Elijah far longer than the sight of the cuffs. The officer guided his father toward the car. A woman nearby whispered, "Shameful." Another man muttered, "Just keep walking." No one stepped in. His mother clutched her purse against her chest, her eyes wet but her lips pressed shut. That silence, her silence, became Elijah's first lesson. Narration whispered again, "Dignity can be stolen in daylight. Justice can be bent by a uniform." And a boy can grow up knowing that his father's pain will one day demand his own voice. That night, Elijah stopped believing silence was safety. The memory of his father's wrists in steel never left Elijah. It followed him into the classroom, where he sat in the back row, silent at first, then steady. Teachers noticed the way he never complained, the way he stayed late to solve problems that others abandoned. "Carter, you don't stop, do you?" one teacher asked, sliding a test paper back. The red A marked more than a grade. It was a ticket forward. He smiled faintly. Stopping doesn't change anything. Narration carried the years between. Scholarships came not as gifts, but as battles won. Nights in law school stretched until dawn, books spread like weapons across his desk. The exhaustion was real, but so was the promise that silence would no longer define him. In debate halls, he rarely raised his voice. When challenged, he answered with pauses that made opponents uneasy. "Mr. Carter, why so quiet?" One rival sneered during a student debate. He leaned into the microphone. "Because sometimes silence makes the loudest man crumble." That line stayed with the audience, echoing long after the debate ended. Campaigns followed, small at first. Church basements, crowded living rooms, folding chairs, no corporate checks. Just neighbors passing envelopes, believers holding signs on corners. "You'll never win against them," a man once warned him. "I don't need to win against them," Elijah said softly. "I need to win for us." Narration lingered again. Each step forward was measured, not in fury, but in control. His victories weren't storms, they were steady winds, shifting walls that had stood for generations. The boy who once clutched his mother's sleeve outside a grocery store now stood tall in chambers of power, and when he entered the Senate floor, the silence belonged to him. ChatGPT said, the senator sat in his office long after the chamber lights dimmed. A manila envelope rested on his desk, edges torn, papers spilling like secrets begging to be heard. He flipped through the files slowly, photographs stapled to forms, shaky handwriting from mothers who had begged for help. "They said he pushed my boy's head against the hood. For no reason," one letter read. The words trembled even on paper. Another sheet carried the cold stamp, unsubstantiated. Elijah whispered the word to himself, his voice bitter. "Unsubstantiated. That's what they call pain when it doesn't fit their record." The door creaked. His aide, Marcus, stepped in quietly. "You're still here." Elijah didn't look up. "Do you know how many times this officer's name shows up?" He held a page toward him. Marcus scanned it, his jaw tightening. "Too many." "They buried it all," Elijah said, tapping the stack. "Every mother who came here walked away with nothing but silence." Marcus hesitated. "If you go after this, they'll come for you. Harder than before." A pause lingered before Elijah spoke again. "They already came for me when I was a boy standing outside that store. I'm not afraid of their paperwork." The narration pressed in. The files weren't just evidence. They were ghosts. Each folder carried a face erased by ink, every complaint a whisper choked by policy. What should have been justice was turned into dust, neatly filed away in cabinets that smelled of old wood and silence. Elijah closed the folder, sliding his hand across the cover as though touching the names themselves. "Not forgotten," he said quietly. "Not this time." And in that stillness, the buried voices began to rise. ChatGPT said. The hallway hummed with low voices, the kind that weren't meant to be heard, but still carried like smoke through thin walls. Elijah stepped, out with the folder under his arm, its weight pressing deeper than paper should. A reporter, leaning against the stair rail, caught his eye. She lowered her voice, though her words still cut. "This isn't their first time. We've seen patterns. Every file you're holding, it connects." Elijah's jaw tightened. Then, "Why does the world know nothing about it?" She glanced around, nervous. "Because every story I tried to run died before print. Editors got calls, my phone rang off the hook, and then Silence. A clerk passing by muttered without stopping. Complaints vanish when the accused wear blue. His eyes stayed on the floor, his shoulders hunched as though even the truth could punish him. Elijah turned slowly, his gaze meeting the grieving mother sitting on the bench at the end of the hall. Her hands trembled around a folded photograph. When she finally spoke, it was a whisper cracked by years of being dismissed. Nobody believed my boy. They said he lied. They said I was just angry. Maybe they'll believe a senator. The narration pressed close. Whispers traveled faster than reports, stronger than signatures. One voice alone had always been drowned. But together, in the cracks of a courthouse hallway, their weight began to bend the air. Elijah walked toward her, his steps slow, heavy. He sat beside her without speaking, the folder resting across his knees. She looked at it, then back at him, her silence asking the question she didn't dare speak. He answered with a single line, steady but low. They'll have to. The whispers quieted. For the first time, the silence carried hope. The clip flickered, across phones, news stations, and late-night feeds. The same 30 seconds, slowed down, paused, dissected frame by frame. A senator's face calm against flashing lights. A cop's voice sharp, unraveling as her badge cut through his arrogance. In the newsroom, a producer whispered, "The views won't stop climbing." Across the city, in a small apartment, a father who had buried his son leaned forward, his hands trembling as he replayed the video. "They hear her," he muttered, almost to himself. "They never heard us." Narration pressed heavy against the silence. For every senator with a badge, there were thousands without one. Thousands who were silenced before the camera rolled. But now the country leaned in, not because truth demanded it, but because power had spoken with the right voice. In a diner, an older man shook his head. "That's what it takes? A title? A seat? A name in their papers?" His friend sipped from a chipped mug, eyes fixed on the muted TV above the counter. "It's not justice. It's a reminder. They listen when it's one of theirs." Meanwhile, in the station where the cop once laughed with his partners, the break room fell quiet. One officer stared at the screen, muttering, "He's done." Another whispered back, "No, we're all exposed now." The weight of silence spread further. Then words. In every room the video played, in every pause between voices, a truth crawled out. Small, bitter, undeniable. The grieving mother from the courthouse watched too. Her whisper cracked the room. "If my boy had worn that badge, maybe..." She stopped herself. Elijah, standing behind her, answered low, steady. "Now they're listening, and they can't turn it off." The precinct felt colder than usual. Chairs scraped louder, footsteps echoed longer, and laughter, once careless, had vanished. Officer Daniels sat alone at the corner table, coffee untouched, eyes darting toward the muted television replaying the senator's video. Each time her badge glimmered on screen, his stomach knotted tighter. "Rough week," a younger officer muttered, passing by without stopping. Daniels looked up. "You think I'm finished?" No answer, just the fading sound of boots on tile. Silence pressed harder than words. Narration threaded quietly. For years, silence had been their weapon. It swallowed complaints, erased witnesses, buried families. Now, silence itself turned back, a mirror they could not escape. In the locker room, two officers spoke low, careful not to meet Daniel's eyes. "Internal Affairs called again." "Yeah, and the union's not backing him this time." "He thought the badge made him untouchable." Their voices cracked with something, close to fear. Daniel slammed his locker shut. "Say it to my face." But the room stayed still. One officer zipped his jacket, eyes on the floor, and walked out without a word. For the first time, Daniels felt the isolation he had forced on others. The shield wasn't just cracking, it was vanishing. Outside, reporters, camped by the steps, microphones waiting, their silence almost daring someone to fill it. Inside City Hall, officials rehearsed statements, but stopped short of defending him. The very leaders who once shook his hand now shifted their weight, eyes down, searching for exits. Narration carried the weight. A wall built on silence cannot stand when silence turns its back. Every whisper in the halls, every averted stare, every withheld word dug deeper than any protest could. Daniels sank onto the bench, breathing heavy. For the first time, he had no one left to silence. ChatGPT said a cough echoed in the back row, sharp against the quiet. The judge's eyes swept the room, steady and calm, and everyone straightened as though the air itself demanded respect. Daniels shifted in his chair, his tie pulled too tight, the weight of stares pressing against his skin. The prosecutor rose, voice measured. "Officer Daniels, on the night in question, did you—" Daniels snapped. "I already told you." "Answer. The question," the judge cut in, her tone low but slicing. Daniels froze. The jury leaned forward. The cameras clicked, and his words caught in his throat. Narration moved like a whisper. For years he had spoken without challenge, his word taken as law. Now even a single sentence felt like stepping into a pit with "no ground beneath," the prosecutor repeated, softer this time. "Did you accuse her of stealing her own car?" Daniels's lips parted, but silence rushed in. He glanced toward his colleagues seated nearby, but none met his eyes. Their faces stayed blank, hands folded tightly in their laps, as if loyalty had evaporated at the courthouse doors. "Officer," the judge pressed. "I might have," he muttered, voice shrinking. Gasps fluttered across the room. The sound of pens scratching against paper filled the silence he could not escape. The judge leaned back, unmoved. "Might have?" Daniels clenched his fists. "I thought—" "No," she interrupted, her voice calm, almost weary. "You didn't think, you assumed." Her words struck heavier than any raised tone. Narration closed the moment. In that silence, the courtroom heard everything: his fear, his weakness, his unraveling, and her restraint, the quiet justice that no shout could ever match. The gavel tapped once, barely louder than a heartbeat. The silence swallowed him whole. Elijah rose slowly, his hands steady at his sides. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment carried his words before they even left his lips. "What happened to me," he said, eyes fixed on the jury, "is not rare." A rustle moved across the room, bodies shifting, the unspoken hanging thick as smoke. Daniels lowered his head, jaw clenched, sweat tracing down his temple. Elijah's pause was deliberate. His voice, when it returned, cut sharper. "The difference is, I had a badge. Countless others do not." The gallery gasped, some covering their mouths, others leaning forward as if struck. Narration lingered. It was not anger that shook the walls, but restraint. Truth spoken without rage, without plea, just laid bare like an open wound no one could deny. Across the aisle, an officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting anywhere but toward Elijah. The prosecutor froze mid-note, letting silence carry, the words further than any closing argument could. Daniels muttered under his breath, "He's exaggerating." But no one echoed him. Even his lawyer shifted slightly away, distance growing without motion. The judge leaned in, her expression unreadable, but her stillness an answer of its own. Elijah's gaze swept the room, not seeking pity, not begging for belief. "I stood on both sides of the law. I know its shield, and I know its weapon. That night, it wasn't justice that spoke to me. It was power, and power alone. No one moved. The hum of cameras, the faint scratching of a pen. Those were the only sounds left. Narration closed in. One sentence carried centuries, pressing down on every shoulder in that room. Shame replaced arrogance. Fear bent into silence. And history shifted, not with thunder, but with calm words that refused to be ignored. Daniels sat stiff, his fists pressed so tight against the table that a thin line of blood surfaced along his knuckles. He didn't notice, or maybe he did and refused to show it. His eyes locked anywhere but Elijah's. Every second of silence made his chest rise heavier, his jaw twitch sharper. Elijah didn't move. He didn't need to. His calm sat in the air like a verdict already written. The cameras zoomed closer, catching Daniels swallowing, catching the officer behind him lowering his gaze, catching the lawyer sliding papers pointlessly across the desk to mask unease. Narration threaded in. Collapse never happens in a shout. It's slow, almost invisible, until it's too late to hide from the eyes watching. A reporter whispered near the gallery, "He's done." The words weren't loud, but the mic picked them up, broadcasted raw. Daniel shifted, muttered under his breath, "This is all twisted." But even that cracked. The microphone caught the tremor. His voice didn't sound like a man in control anymore. It sounded like a man unraveling. The judge's gavel never came down. It didn't need to. Silence was enough. Silence was judgment. Outside, screens lit up. Headlines blinked in red. Senator Elijah Carter breaks courtroom silence. Clips replayed his words, each pause more piercing the second time. On buses, in diners, on phones clutched by teenagers and elders alike, the scene played again and again. Narration whispered, "Justice did not roar. It seeped. It crawled into every living room, every feed, every conversation. Power lost not in our thunder, but in 1,000 quiet echoes." Daniels rubbed his knuckles once more, the blood smeared faintly. This time he looked up, and the camera caught it, the look of a man who knew the fight was already gone. The nights grew longer for them, though the clocks ticked the same. Daniels sat by his kitchen window, the glow of an overdue bill stacked under a half-empty glass. His phone hadn't rung in weeks. No one asked for favors anymore. No one asked at all. Across town, Morris, once quick with a smirk, now walked streets where eyes turned away. The bakery he visited every morning no longer greeted him with warmth. The bar where he laughed the loudest no longer poured him a drink. Silence became his shadow, thicker than shame, harder than noise. Narration carried softly, "The fall is never in the strike. It's in the stillness after, when the world simply forgets you were ever needed." "Bill due," Daniels muttered under his breath, tracing the red letters. His wife lingered in the doorway, arms folded, no words offered. She didn't need to. "Speak!" The silence spoke louder than she ever could. A neighbor crossed the street instead of sharing the sidewalk. Children who once waved now hid behind their mothers. Daniels caught their glances, quick and cutting, and lowered his head. Morris tried to defend himself one night at the diner. "It wasn't like that," he said, voice breaking, fork rattling against the plate. The waitress didn't answer, didn't look up, just cleared the table beside him. That silence burned more than accusation. Narration whispered again, "Some men are not buried by anger, but by absence. No audience, no echo. Only their names left hanging in the air like a warning. The arrogance that once roared under flashing lights now lay drowned under unpaid bills, empty tables, and unreturned calls. They weren't destroyed in one moment. They were erased in every moment after. The applause never came with microphones. It came in the rustle of folding chairs, the nods of elders who had seen too much, and the shy smiles of children learning to see themselves in his words. Elijah Carter moved through the hall slowly, stopping for every handshake, every eye that needed meeting. "Senator," an older man said, gripping his arm, "we thought they'd bury us quiet, but you stood." His voice cracked, then broke into silence. Elijah answered softly, "No one stands alone. I only carried what you already carried." At the back of the room, a young girl clutched her notebook. She asked, almost whispering, "Does it ever stop hurting? When they look at you like you don't belong?" The question lingered in the stale air. Elijah bent to her level. "It doesn't stop," he said, steady, "but it stops owning you. Your dignity, that's your badge. Nobody takes it, unless you hand it over." Narration slipped in. He didn't lift voices by shouting louder. He lifted them by making silence feel less heavy. Teachers wiped tears quietly. Parents sat straighter, as if the shame that once hunched their shoulders no longer fit. The room felt different, not louder, not brighter, just steadier. As Elijah left, an old woman pressed a folded paper into his hand. "Not for the cameras," she murmured. Inside was a prayer written in shaky script. He didn't read it then, but he held it like something unbreakable. Narration closed the moment. Justice was not in speeches. It was in rooms like these where the forgotten remembered themselves, where children learned they were not shadows, but flame. He walked out the door without turning back. The people did not cheer. They breathed easier. The chamber was restless. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, and the weight of cameras pressed into every pause. Elijah Carter stood, not rushing, not adjusting his notes. His eyes traced the room, like a man measuring its honesty. When he finally spoke, it was almost too soft. "They put cuffs on truth," he said, "but truth does not bruise. It waits." A murmur swept the floor, half disdain, half unease. A senator across the aisle smirked. "Spare us the sermon. You're here to legislate, not lecture." Elijah didn't look at him. "No," he answered calmly. "I'm here to remind you. Truth cannot be arrested." The words hung there. Not shouted, not defended, just left to breathe. Some turned their heads down, as though the sentence pressed on their own shoulders. Narration folded in. It was not the force of volume, but the force of restraint that broke the room. His silence afterward weighed heavier than arguments ever could. A younger senator whispered almost to herself, "He said what we've all been afraid to say." The microphones caught it. The nation heard. News tickers lit up within the hour. Clips replayed endlessly. Children scribbled the line in school notebooks. Elders repeated it at kitchen tables. It wasn't politics anymore. It was a wound uncovered. Back. In the chamber, Elijah simply lowered his papers and sat. The gavel struck, motions carried on, voices argued again. But the sentence lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. Narration closed the scene. History does not remember the noise. It remembers the words that cut through it. And some words, once spoken, cannot be erased. Elijah glanced once toward the gallery, toward the people watching. He gave no smile, no nod, just stillness.